Hello again, this is Dr. Lindsay. And in this video, what I want to do is go over the practice handout on stabilization with monetary policy. So this first question, the economy is at an unemployment rate of 3%. So that's very low. That's much greater than full employment. We're out beyond the PPF. GDP growth rate is 4%. That's a very good growth rate. Remember, normal growth rate is 3%. So 4% means the economy is growing very well. Draw this kind of situation here. So inflation is at 7%. And Y star here, our output, is greater than potential. The federal funds rate is 6%. So that means the short-term interest rate, nominal interest rate, is 6%. Is the federal funds rate. And inflation rate here is 7%, which is quite high. So what is the real interest rate? The real interest rate then would be -1%, which means the Fed is probably being very loose. They have a loose policy, or accommodative policy. They're being expansionary. And we are right here. So this would be our short-run equilibrium. We assume that we get to short-run equilibrium very quickly, but it takes a long time to get to long-run equilibrium. And the long-run equilibrium is where aggregate demand hits that long-run aggregate supply curve. We will get there eventually. In this case, inflation might be a lot higher when we finally get to them. So we're not in long-run equilibrium. We are in short-run equilibrium, keeping in mind the dual mandates of the Fed, which is stable prices and maximum sustainable output, which means an output at potential. What do you think the Fed or the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, that arm of the Fed that makes monetary policy decisions, should do? Well, we need to move away from this expansionary or loose monetary policy to more of a neutral stance. So we need to raise the federal funds rate. So it's already at 6%. It needs to go higher. How much higher? It's hard to say. They don't want to do it too fast, don't want to shock the economy, don't want to have a big drop in aggregate demand causing recession. So they'll do it slowly. Move from 6.25, then 6.5, and try to slowly move that up to where R star is going to be maybe around 1% or so for a neutral stance. And then since that inflation rate is still pretty high, that means they're probably going to have to go to a contractionary stance and move R up higher than that. Exactly where? Maybe it's an R of 2%. So they might have to bump this federal funds rate maybe up to 9%. It's hard to say exactly. They'll play it by ear. They'll do it slowly and try not to contract the economy too suddenly and cause a downturn. Okay, next question. Suppose the economy is above potential, positive output gap, unemployment rate of 3.4%, very low unemployment rate, and inflation rate of only 1.5%. Very low, maybe even too low. Federal Reserve would like to have it higher than that. Federal funds rate of 1.75%. Suddenly there's an unexpected virus causing a pandemic. Sound familiar? People cut back on their spending. Nobody starts flying, afraid to go out to eat or vacation. The government imposes a lockdown, essentially hitting a pause on the economy. and ordering everyone to stay home. So what's going to happen here in this economy? What's going to happen to aggregate demand? It will decrease. The C plus I plus G, consumption spending is going to decrease. Investment spending is going to decrease too. Now, what would happen when the government puts a pause, hits the pause button on the economy? That shifts the aggregate supply curve to the left. Decrease in aggregate supply. And we get a new equilibrium here. In actuality, what happened was when that pandemic hit, there was some deflation that occurred after that, not too long after that, which meant the aggregate demand curve fell more, shifted more to the left than the aggregate supply curve did. So what could be done about this? Well, Congress and the president could increase government spending or lowering taxes, and that's what they did. Trillions of dollars of spending and lowering taxes. What could the Fed do via the FOMC? Well, they could lower the federal funds rate. Federal funds rate, they could drop that. It was at 1.75. They dropped it down to 0 almost immediately. And once it hit 0, they chose not to take it into negative territory, but to leave it at 0. And the question is, was the Federal Reserve out of bullets once they got down to 0? And the answer is no, they were not out of bullets, because then they started increasing the money supply substantially, but buying other things with it. So they started buying longer term bonds with it and buying mortgage bonds with that money too for a long time to bring interest rates down on the mortgages. So it made it cheaper to buy a home, bringing those interest rates down, bringing the long-term interest rates down. They started spending money on corporate bonds to bring interest rates down on corporate bonds. So they tried to just use their money to bring down every kind of interest rate that they could, not just the US government bonds, bringing down that interest rate, and with the intent of trying to shift that aggregate demand curve back up as much as they could with monetary policy. And at the same time, they felt there was only so much they could do with monetary policy because the Fed can't create a vaccine, that they called upon Congress and the Fed to try to do as much as they could with fiscal policy also, and just directly giving people more money with unemployment or stimulus checks in the hopes that they're going to go out and spend it, and that will increase the aggregate demand. Just to show you a graph here is the monetary base. And you can see how the Fed increased the monetary base substantially when that pandemic hit by a few $1 trillion very quickly to lower interest rates. And I'll show you M1. That translated to an increase in M1 also. And this graph, this shows M1. And you can see that increasing the monetary base had a big effect by increasing M1 also. And once again, it was to increase the money supply, lower interest rates, to try and increase aggregate demand to make up for the drop in aggregate demand that the pandemic caused. Now the question is, where is the inflation? And when will that show up? Because you can see M1 increased from about 4 trillion up to almost 7 trillion right now while I'm looking at that graph. The inflation hasn't shown up yet because it takes a while for inflation to show up. Plus, the velocity of money has been dropping at the same time. And the inflation is not going to start showing up until that velocity of money gets back up or starts to go back up. Okay, question number 3. GDP for the last 2 quarters has been reported as negative 0.5%. 2 quarters in a row with negative GDP growth is a recession. Draw this situation, and I've done it below, where we've got an intersection between aggregate supply and aggregate demand that is below potential. Price has been the same over the last year. That means the inflation rate is 0. Federal funds rate is 7%. That's a nominal rate. What's the real interest rate? Well, I equals real rate plus inflation. So 7 equals R plus 0. R has to be 7%. So that's a very high real interest rate. So I would describe the stance of monetary policy as very tight or a very contractionary. So right now, this is our short run equilibrium here, Y star and 0%. If nothing's done, eventually we'll be in a long run equilibrium at full employment. It may take some time to get there. That'll be where the long run aggregate supply curve intersects the aggregate demand curve. But that's even at a lower inflation rate than 0, be something negative. So if the Fed doesn't change its stance, what do you think will happen to inflation expectations? Well, people's expectations of inflation are going to be actually that they're going to be expecting no inflation or even deflation after a while. Keeping in mind the dual mandates the Fed has, what do you think the FOMC should do? Well, they need to raise the inflation rate as part of their dual mandate to keep prices stable. They want to have higher inflation, and they'd like to have higher GDP, higher output. So they're going to have to do something here to increase aggregate demand. And they'll have to do that by lowering the federal funds rate. So right now it's at 7. They're going to have to start lowering that, increase aggregate demand. And then the result would be it will keep prices from falling and hopefully even raise prices a little bit. How far are they going to have to go? The lower that nominal interest rate, the federal funds rate, they're going to have to move that down substantially. They may have to move it down close to 0 to get back to a real interest rate that's close to the neutral real rate of interest. So our R here is definitely greater than R star. 7% is greater than maybe whatever it is, whatever R star is right now, maybe 1%. So it will be dropping that. Okay, now in this last problem here, the economy is inside the PPF. So we're below potential. Latest quarterly GDP growth is negative 1%. So not so good. The economy really isn't growing. Inflation's running at 8% annually. So we have this high inflation rate, and yet the economy isn't doing very well. This is referred to as stagflation, where we've got a stagnant economy, we've got inflation going on at the same time. Federal funds rate is 9%. That's the nominal interest rate. What's the real interest rate? That would be a real interest rate of 1%. What are people's expectations of inflation? Well, they're pretty high. If the inflation's running 8%, people probably have expectations that it's going to be running at 8 or 9%. So what should the Fed do here? They've got two problems. The economy's not doing well, maybe in a recession, and inflation's too high. So they've got their dual mandate of maximum sustainable employment, right, keeping us at potential output, and keeping prices stable, and 8% is too high. So what should they do? Should they increase aggregate demand or decrease aggregate demand? Lower the federal funds rate to increase aggregate demand, or raise the federal funds rate to decrease aggregate demand? They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here. If they increase the federal funds rate, it'll lower aggregate demand. And it's going to make output drop even more. It's going to make the economy worse. There's already a recession that's going to make it worse. Inflation is going to drop a little bit, but it's going to take some time. If they lower the federal funds rate, that will increase aggregate demand and improve the economy, bring us closer to potential, but it's probably going to make inflation even worse down the road. So the question is, well, what should they do? They've got their dual mandates. So really what it comes down to here, what they've done in the past, it's, well, what's more important to work on? Is inflation more important, or is it the economy more important? And what I found is if there's a recession going on, the economy's not doing well, that will be what's most important to them, not the inflation rate. So they'll probably increase aggregate demand here, try to get us back to potential, even though it's going to make the inflation problem worse down the road. And then when we get back to potential and the economy is doing okay, then they'll start to work on the inflation rate and attempt to bring that back down later after the economy's out of this recession or out of the woods and is doing better.